The night of my wedding reception, I stood at the edge of a ballroom holding my phone and 297 people fell silent. Not because I asked them to. Because my mother's voice was coming through the speakers, and every single word she said was meant for someone else. I had found the voicemail 4 days before the wedding. I had listened to it once, sitting in the parking lot of the florist where I'd just paid the final balance on the centerpieces. I sat there for 11 minutes without moving. Then I saved it, archived it, and drove home. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just held the phone in both hands and understood, with a clarity I'd been fighting my whole life, that my mother had just handed me the most honest thing she'd ever given me. All I had to do was decide what to do with it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. My mother's name is Sandra. Sandra Calloway before she took back her maiden name after the divorce, and Sandra Harmon in every space where she performed the version of herself she liked best. She is 61 years old, 5 feet 4, and she has spent the better part of 4 decades constructing a public image the way other women build careers. She knows everyone worth knowing in Millhaven, the kind of mid-sized Georgia city where the right dinner invitation matters more than your credit score. She sits on the board of 2 charities, volunteers at the Historical Society every second Tuesday, and hosts a Christmas open house every December that 40 people attend and 300 hear about. In 37 years of motherhood, she never missed a single one of my sister Becca's events. Dance recitals, volleyball championships, college graduation, the launch of Becca's boutique on Main Street. Sandra was in the front row for every single one. My events were different. My piano recital at age 9, she arrived 20 minutes late and left before the reception. My high school honor society induction, she came but spent the ceremony in the hallway taking a phone call she later described as urgent. My college graduation from Georgia State, she brought flowers for Becca, who wasn't graduating, and forgot mine in the car. These are not complaints. I stopped filing them as complaints a long time ago. They are just the record, the same way a weather log records the temperature without judging the cold. The pattern was established early. Becca was the daughter Sandra wanted to be seen with. I was the daughter Sandra tolerated having. The gap between those two things is exactly where I grew up, and everything I became in that gap. My name is Nina Harmon. I am 34 years old. At the time of my wedding, I had been running my own interior design firm for 6 years. Harmon Design had billed $1.2 million the previous fiscal year. I employed 8 people. I had been featured in Atlanta Home magazine twice, once in 2021 and once in 2023. My office was on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown Atlanta that I had helped design and that 2 of my clients jointly owned. None of this impressed my mother. Or rather, she never let it. When I told her about the first Atlanta Home feature, she said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Becca got a write-up in the Millhaven Courier last month." The Millhaven Courier had a circulation of 4,000. Atlanta Home had 300,000 subscribers. I didn't say that. I never said things like that. Becca is 2 years older than me. She is warm and loud and effortlessly likable in the way that people who have never been told they're difficult tend to be. I don't blame Becca for what my mother built between us. She didn't ask to be the favorite. She was just willing to receive it, and Sandra was willing to give it endlessly, which is a combination that produces a particular kind of entitlement that looks like confidence from the outside and costs everyone else dearly from the inside. When Becca wanted to open her boutique, she called our mother first. Sandra contributed $42,000 over 18 months. She told people it was an investment in family. When I was starting my firm and needed a short-term bridge to cover payroll for 3 months while 2 large invoices cleared, I asked my mother if she could loan me $30,000. I had a repayment plan ready. I had the invoices, the contracts, everything printed. Sandra looked at the documents for 3 minutes and said, "Nina, I think you need to reconsider whether this business is the right path for you. Not everyone is built for entrepreneurship." I found the bridge funding through a small business loan from a community bank and paid it back in 5 months. The boutique, funded by Sandra, closed in its 3rd year. My firm is still open. The relationship between my mother and my fiancé Daniel began cordially and deteriorated quietly. Daniel Reyes is an architect. We met at a project site in 2019 when his firm and mine were both brought in on a mixed-use development in Decatur. He is measured, patient, funny in the dry way that takes a moment to land, and the only man I had ever dated who didn't need me to be smaller so he could feel bigger. Sandra met him at Christmas of 2020. She was perfectly pleasant for the 4 hours we were there. In the car home, she told me she thought Daniel was a little serious and that she wasn't sure we had enough chemistry to last. Becca's boyfriend at the time, a man named Marcus who had borrowed money from 4 family members and repaid none of it, was described by Sandra as so full of life. By the time Daniel proposed in October of 2022, Sandra had met him 11 times. She had asked him exactly 4 personal questions across all 11 encounters. She knew his first name, that he was an architect, and nothing else, because she had not tried to know anything else. Daniel proposed at the botanical garden with a ring he had spent 6 months designing with a jeweler. I said yes before he finished the question. I called Becca first. Becca screamed. I called my mother second. Sandra said, "Oh. Well, that's wonderful. When are you thinking?" We set the date for October 14, 2023. I planned the wedding almost entirely on my own. Daniel helped with the decisions that needed 2 people. Becca was my maid of honor and genuinely wonderful at it. I hired a coordinator named Pilar who had run events for 12 years and whom I trusted completely. Sandra was offered a role. I sat across from her at her kitchen table in March and asked if she wanted to be involved in the dress shopping, the florals, the venue walkthrough. She said she was very busy through the spring. She never specified with what. The invitation went out in July. I designed it myself. Cream letterpress paper, my firm's subtle geometric pattern along the border, envelopes lined in dusty rows. 293 people received one. I sent my mother's separately, by certified mail, with a handwritten note tucked inside asking her to please let me know if she needed anything at all, transportation, a hotel recommendation, anything, and that I loved her and I wanted her there. The RSVP came back on a Tuesday in August. I was at the office when the mail arrived. My assistant Camille brought it to my desk with the rest of the stack. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope before I opened it. Sandra's return address in the upper left corner, her careful controlled cursive. I opened it with a letter opener. Inside was the RSVP card I had sent, the one that read, "Kindly reply by August 30th," with 2 printed options. Joyfully accepts on the left. Regretfully declines on the right. Neither box was checked. Instead, across the front of the card in my mother's handwriting, in blue ballpoint pen pressed so hard the ink had almost cut the paper, were 2 words. Not invited. Not I can't make it. Not regretfully declines. Not even a phone call first. 2 words, written like a correction. Like someone had made an administrative error she was setting right. I sat at my desk for 4 minutes without moving. Then I placed the RSVP card in the top drawer, closed it, picked up my phone, and called Pilar to confirm the linen order. I told no one for 8 days. The voicemail came 4 days before the wedding. I had been at the florist finalizing the centerpiece order. 42 tables, white ranunculus, eucalyptus, a single stem of blush anthurium in each arrangement. Final payment, $6,340. Paid in full. I was in the parking lot checking my phone before driving back to the office. I had a voicemail. The number was my mother's. I assumed it was about the wedding, some last-minute explanation or retraction of the RSVP, and I pressed play. What I heard instead was 3 minutes and 47 seconds that my mother believed she was leaving for my sister. She had called the wrong number. She didn't know she had called me. I listened to all of it. 3 minutes and 47 seconds, sitting in a parking lot next to a receipt for ranunculus I had just paid $6,000 for, listening to my mother say things she had spent 34 years never saying to my face. She said that my wedding was an exercise in Nina overreaching. She said that Daniel's family clearly had no idea what they were getting into. She said that she had called 2 of my father's cousins who were on the guest list and suggested to them that the wedding might not be worth the trip. She said the reason she wrote "not invited" on the RSVP was because she wanted me to understand my own limits. She said, almost as an aside, casual as a grocery list, that she had never believed I would amount to anything, and that the fact that I had a little business didn't change the 30 years of evidence she had collected. She said Becca deserved better than having me as a sister. Then the voicemail ended. The parking lot was still. A car pulled in 3 spots over. A woman got out carrying a dry cleaning order. A pigeon landed on the curb. I sat there and counted to 60 in my head because I needed something to do with my hands and I had left them on the steering wheel. Then I listened to the voicemail again. Then I saved it to a folder on my phone labeled vendor contacts, because I didn't want anyone to find it by accident. Then I drove back to the office, submitted the linen confirmation to Pilar, and approved the final seating chart. I had 4 days to decide what to do with 3 minutes and 47 seconds of the most honest thing my mother had ever given me. The honest answer is that I had always known. Not the specifics, not the exact words she used when I wasn't in the room, but the shape of them. You learn the shape of a thing long before you learn its name. I was 7 when I understood that Sandra attended my events the way someone attends a work obligation they cannot cancel. Present, technically. Elsewhere, entirely. I was 12 when I understood that Becca was the daughter Sandra had wanted and I was the daughter Sandra had received, and that the distance between those 2 things was permanent and not my fault, though I spent most of my adolescence trying to close it anyway. I was 19 when I stopped trying. The stopping was quiet. There was no confrontation, no letter, no declaration of independence. I just slowly redirected the energy I had been spending on being good enough for Sandra and pointed it towards something that actually gave back. I finished my design degree. I took an internship that paid nothing and taught me everything. I worked for a firm in Atlanta for 3 years and saved every dollar I didn't spend. At 28, I started Harmon Design with $14,000 in savings, a second-hand drafting table, and 1 client, a woman named Georgiana Marsh, who hired me to redesign her dining room and ended up referring me to 11 other people in the first 6 months. What I had not learned, what I kept discovering I hadn't learned every time I thought I had, was how to stop wanting my mother to show up. That is the specific grief I am describing. Not the grief of a mother who hurt me, though that is part of it. The grief of a daughter who kept hoping, long past the point of reasonable hope, that this time would be different. That this milestone would be the one that mattered enough. That a wedding, of all things, would be the event so significant that Sandra would choose presence over performance. I had built her a role. I had designed a seat in the front row. I had sent a handwritten note. And she had sent back 2 words in blue ballpoint. I showed Daniel the RSVP the evening after I found the voicemail. We were in our apartment in Midtown. He was cooking pasta. I came in, set my bag down, and placed the RSVP card on the counter without explanation. He read it. He was quiet for 15 seconds, which with Daniel is a long time. Then he turned the burner off and turned around. How long have you had this? 8 days. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me, and I stood in the hug without moving, because I had been managing this so carefully for 8 days that the weight of being held by someone who had actually chosen me was almost more than I could absorb. I love you, I said into his shoulder. I love you too. He pulled back and looked at me. What do you want to do? And then I told him about the voicemail. I watched his face while he listened. Daniel's face is not particularly expressive, which is one of the things I love about it. He processes before he reacts, and his reactions are always proportional to the truth rather than to the performance of an emotion. He listened to the entire 3 minutes and 47 seconds standing at the kitchen counter with the pasta going cold. When it ended, he was quiet for 30 seconds. Your mother called your father's cousins and tried to talk them out of coming. Yes. He nodded, very slowly. And she doesn't know she left this on your phone. No. Another 15 seconds of silence. Do you have an idea about what you want to do with it? I looked at him. I looked at the man who had spent 6 months designing a ring, who had asked my grandmother Eleanor's permission before my father's because he understood which family members had actually been present, who had learned the name of every client on my roster in the first month we dated because he paid attention to what mattered to me. I looked at him and said, yes. I have an idea. He waited. At the reception, I said. He understood immediately. I know because he nodded once, went back to the stove, turned the burner on, and said, tell me what you need. That is the man I married. I spent the next 3 days doing 2 things simultaneously. I finalized the last details of a wedding I had spent 14 months planning, and I rehearsed a decision. Not the logistics of it. The decision itself. I am a careful person by nature. I do not make choices from the center of an emotion. I was not angry in a way that demanded release. I was clear in a way that required action. My mother had called 2 of my relatives and tried to diminish this day before it arrived. She had written 2 words across a card I had designed and sent with a handwritten note. She had spent 3 minutes and 47 seconds telling my sister, in words she believed were private, exactly what she thought of me and the life I had built. Those words were now in my possession. The question was not whether they deserved to be heard. The question was whether I was willing to be the one to make them heard, in a room full of 300 people who were gathering to celebrate a life she had spent decades underestimating. I thought about it the way I think about a difficult design decision. What is the function? What is the purpose? Who does it serve? This is not revenge, I told myself on the second night before the wedding, sitting at my desk with the seating chart on one screen and my client files on the other. Revenge is satisfying a wound. This is something else. This is holding a door open so everyone in the room can see what was always on the other side of it. Becca called me the night before the wedding. We talked for 45 minutes. She asked if I was nervous. I said I was ready. She asked if I had heard from Sandra. I told her I had not, which was technically accurate. She said she was sorry, that she had called our mother twice and gotten voicemail both times, that she didn't understand why Sandra was doing this, that she had tried. I believed her. Becca had always operated in the space between the 2 of us, trying to hold both sides without fully understanding the cost of that position. She wasn't complicit in what Sandra did. She just wasn't present for most of it, which is a different kind of unavailability. I love you, Becca, I said. Tomorrow is going to be beautiful. She cried a little. I'm so proud of you, Nina. She meant it. I went to sleep at 11 o'clock and slept 7 hours, which surprised me. I woke up on the morning of my wedding and stood in the kitchen with my coffee and looked at the October sky through the window and thought about what my grandmother Eleanor had told me the first time she saw the ring. She had held my hand in both of hers, looked at the stone for a long time, and then looked at me and said, the best thing about the people who underestimate you is how much room they leave for you to become exactly who you are. I had been becoming exactly who I was for 34 years. Today, in front of 300 people, every single one of them was going to see it. The venue was called the Ivy House. A restored Victorian mansion 20 minutes outside of Atlanta, for white columns at the entrance, ivy climbing the east wall all the way to the second floor, a ballroom inside with original heart pine floors and 12-foot ceilings and tall windows that turned gold in the late afternoon light. I had found it 18 months before the wedding while driving to a client consultation in Roswell. I had pulled into the gravel driveway on instinct, walked to the front door, and spoken to the event manager for 40 minutes before I had even called Daniel to describe it. Some spaces speak to you before you've made a decision about them. This one said, this is where something permanent happens. I arrived at the Ivy House at 8:45 in the morning on October 14, 2023. Pilar was already there. She had been there since 7. The florists were arranging the ceremony arch, a sweeping structure of white ranunculus and eucalyptus and blush anthurium that matched the centerpieces on every table in the ballroom. The caterers were unloading in the back. The DJ, a man named Marcus who had done 12 events with Pilar and who I had met twice during the planning process, was setting up the soundboard in the far corner of the ballroom. I stood in the doorway of the ballroom in my street clothes with my dress bag over one shoulder and looked at the room. 42 tables, ivory linens, crystal glassware catching the early light. 300 chairs set in ceremony rows outside in the garden, 2 white ribbons marking the aisle. Everything I had planned for 14 months was exactly where it was supposed to be. Pilar appeared at my elbow. "You good?" "Yes," I said. And I was. I was precisely as good as I needed to be for what this day required, which included 2 things I had been carrying quietly for the last 4 days. Pilar had pulled me aside 3 weeks earlier during the final venue walkthrough. She had gone through the entire reception timeline, course by course, toast by toast, down to the last song of the night. At the end, I had told her I wanted to add something small. After the formal toasts from the best man and the maid of honor, I wanted to take the microphone myself for 2 minutes. I wanted my phone connected to the main sound system at that point. A direct line through the DJ's board. Pilar had looked at me for a moment. She is perceptive in the way that good event coordinators have to be. She reads rooms before people are in them. She read me now. "Is this planned?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's planned." She had written it into the timeline without another word. That is what I mean when I say I trusted her completely. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring more emotional stories like this one. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. 293 of the 300 guests were present in the garden. The other 7 were inside helping with 11th-hour details. My father, Robert, walked me down the aisle. We had not spoken in depth about Sandra or the RSVP. He knew about the name change from the invitation, that I still carried Harmon, his name, and not Calloway. He had squeezed my hand when we rehearsed the walk the night before and said simply, "I'm proud of you, Nina. I'm proud of who you turned out to be." It was not the longest speech anyone had ever given me. It was enough. Daniel was standing at the end of the aisle in a charcoal suit and an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not nervous. Not composed in his usual calculated way. Something quieter than both. He looked like a man who had just understood something essential and was grateful to have arrived at the understanding in time. I walked toward him and the garden and the guests, and the late afternoon Georgia light fell away to everything else until there was only the 20 feet of white ribbon between us, and then there wasn't. The ceremony lasted 31 minutes. The officiant was Daniel's oldest friend, a man named Theo who had known him since graduate school and who spoke about Daniel with the specific authority of someone who had watched him make decisions under pressure for 15 years. He said Daniel was a man who built things designed to outlast themselves. He said a marriage was the most ambitious structure either of us would ever attempt. He said the best blueprints are made by people who are honest about the load they're designing for. When the officiant asked if anyone had any objections, the garden was perfectly quiet. I had thought about that moment in the days before the wedding. I had thought about who might not be there to fill that silence, and who was exactly where they needed to be. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Nobody spoke. It was the most complete 4 seconds of my life. I kissed my husband in the October afternoon light while 300 people stood and the DJ played the song we had chosen, a piece Daniel had found 3 years earlier and filed away under our shared notes folder labeled Someday. That was the kind of man I had married. The kind who files things away for someday because he believes someday is coming. Cocktail hour. The guests moved from the garden into the ballroom and the wraparound porch while the room transitioned for dinner. Daniel and I stepped away for photographs with our photographer, a woman named Claudia who moved through events like water, present everywhere and noticed nowhere. We were gone for 40 minutes. When we returned to the ballroom for the reception entrance, Becca was waiting just outside the door. She was holding her bouquet in both hands so tightly that the stems had bent. Her eyes were red at the edges in the careful, controlled way of someone who had been crying and then stopped and was working hard to keep it stopped. She looked at me and something shifted in her expression. Not pity. Recognition. "One of Daniel's aunts," she said quietly. She pulled me aside during cocktail hour. She said Mom called her last week. She said Mom told her the wedding wasn't worth the trip. Becca's voice was perfectly level. It was costing her. She said she almost didn't come. She said she only came because she wanted to tell me to my face that she was sorry for what Mom said. I took Becca's hand. Her fingers were cold from holding the stems. "I know," I said. Becca looked at me. "How long have you known?" 4 days. She was quiet for a moment. In the ballroom, I could hear the DJ playing the introductory music, the warm sound of 300 people settling into chairs, the clink of glasses being filled. "Are you going to do something about it?" Becca asked. I looked at my sister. My maid of honor. The person Sandra had always put first and who had, in spite of that, shown up for me across 14 months of planning and 45 minutes on the phone the night before, and right now, here, in a hallway outside a ballroom with bent bouquet stems and red-rimmed eyes, making sure I was all right before walking through a door. "Yes," I said. "But not until after your toast. Your toast is going to be beautiful, Becca. And I need you to give it first." She nodded once. She straightened her shoulders. She looked exactly like someone who had spent her whole life receiving credit and was only now beginning to understand what the alternative looked like. We walked through the door. The ballroom was everything I had designed it to be. The heart pine floors warm under the chandeliers. The ranunculus white against the ivory linens. 42 tables, 300 people, all of them rising when Daniel and I crossed the threshold. We took our places at the sweetheart table at the front of the room. Pilar handed me a glass of champagne. Across the room, I made eye contact with Marcus at the DJ booth. He gave me a single nod. The phone line to the sound system was ready. Everything was in its place. The formal toasts began at 6:45. Daniel's best man, a man named Greg who had given at least a dozen wedding speeches and had perfected the rhythm of making a room laugh before making them cry, went first. He talked about Daniel's precision, his patience, his habit of being the last person to speak in any meeting because he was still listening while everyone else had already decided. He said that Nina was the only project Daniel had ever pursued without a single revision. The room laughed. I laughed too, which was real. Then Becca stood. She had not written her speech down. I knew this because she had told me 3 months earlier, when I asked if she needed anything for the toast preparation, that she was going to speak from memory. "I've been composing this in my head since you called me from the botanical garden," she said. "I've had a year." She spoke for 7 minutes. She talked about growing up with me, which she described as watching someone figure it out from the inside while making it look effortless from the outside. She talked about a specific memory, the two of us at ages 11 and 9 sitting on the back steps of our mother's house in Millhaven on a summer night, and how I had said to her, unprompted, that I was going to live somewhere I chose myself and build something I owned, and that nobody was going to be able to write my name on a list or leave it off one. Becca said she hadn't understood what I meant at the time. She said she understood now. She turned and looked at Daniel and said, "You found someone who already knew exactly who she was. All you had to do was recognize it." She raised her glass. The room raised theirs. Becca looked at me and her eyes were bright and full, and she said, "To Nina, who never needed anyone to believe in her, but deserves everyone in this room to say it out loud." 300 people said it out loud. I stood. I had not told Becca what I was about to do. I had told Daniel. I had told Pilar. I had told no one else because it was not their decision to carry. I crossed the 3 steps between the sweetheart table and the center microphone stand. The room settled. People assumed I was about to give a thank you, the standard bride's acknowledgement before dinner. I let them assume that for about 15 seconds while I stood at the microphone and looked at the room. 300 faces. Daniel's family on the left side, warm and numerous and inclusive in the way that only large families with decades of practice at welcoming people can be. My father in the 4th row, hands folded on the table, watching me with the alert stillness of a man who knew his daughter was about to do something important. My grandmother Eleanor beside him in her blue silk dress, the one she had bought specifically for this evening, the one she had shown me on a video call 3 weeks prior, turning slowly so I could see every angle. Becca, still standing, glass in hand, the brightness still in her eyes. 300 people who had come from 6 states to be here, not one of whom had been talked out of it. Thank you, I said. All of you. For being here. For the distance you traveled, the hours you drove, the flights you took. I want you to know that every single person in this room was chosen deliberately. You are here because you matter to us. Because you showed up when it counted. I paused. My mother could not be here tonight. I said it simply, the way you state a fact you are not ashamed of. Many of you know that. Some of you may have wondered why. Another pause. Briefer. She did reach out, actually. 4 days ago. I reached into the small pocket of my reception dress, the one Pilar had specifically built into the design at my request 3 months earlier, and I took out my phone. I looked at Marcus at the DJ board. He gave me the nod. I found the saved voicemail in my folder labeled vendor contacts. I pressed play. My mother's voice came through the speakers at a volume that reached every corner of the Ivy House ballroom, clear and warm and completely unguarded, the voice of a woman who believed she was speaking in private. 3 minutes and 47 seconds. The ballroom was so quiet during those 3 minutes and 47 seconds that I could hear the chandelier crystals moving in the air conditioning current overhead. I watched the room as my mother's voice filled it. I watched Daniel's aunt, the one who had called Becca aside at cocktail hour, press her hand flat against her chest. I watched my father's eyes go from alert to still in the way of someone absorbing something they had suspected for a long time but had not been handed proof of. I watched my grandmother Eleanor, who had been in the world for 78 years and had seen a great many things, simply fold her hands on the table and look at me with an expression I had no word for. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. I watched Becca. She was still standing. She had not sat down from her toast. She stood at her place at the head table holding her champagne glass in one hand, listening to our mother's voice describe her younger sister as someone who would never amount to anything, someone whose wedding was an exercise in overreaching, someone whose husband's family clearly had no idea what they were getting into. Becca's face moved through 6 different expressions in 3 minutes and 47 seconds, and none of them were the ones she performed in public. Every one of them was real. Every one of them cost her something. When the voicemail ended, the room was silent. I stood at the microphone and let the silence be what it was. I did not rush it. I did not fill it. I let 300 people sit inside it for a breath, 2 breaths, 3, long enough for it to become something they would remember, long enough for the truth of it to settle into the room the way a note settles after the instrument stops. Then I said, she called the wrong number. Everything else, she meant. I set the microphone back in the stand, crossed the 3 steps to the sweetheart table, sat down beside my husband, and placed my hand over his on the tablecloth. Daniel did not speak. He turned his hand palm up and closed his fingers around mine. That was all. The room came back in pieces. A sound here, a murmur there, the slow return of air to a space that had been holding its breath. I heard someone cry, a quiet, contained sound from somewhere in the middle tables. I heard someone else say something low and emphatic to the person next to them. I did not turn to see who. I had said what I came to the microphone to say. The room would process it in its own time, in its own way. That was no longer my work. Pilar appeared at my shoulder 15 seconds later. She crouched beside my chair and spoke at a volume meant only for me. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said. "Do you want me to move the dinner service forward?" "Give it 2 more minutes," I said. "Let them breathe." She nodded and moved away without another word. That is what it looks like when you hire the right person. They do not require explanation. They extend trust in both directions and the work gets done. Becca came to me before dinner began. She did not sit down. She stood at the edge of the sweetheart table and looked at me for a long moment in the way of someone recalculating something important. "Did you know she called Daniel's aunt?" Becca asked. "I knew she called our father's cousins. I suspected others." Becca was quiet. "I called her after the RSVP came back. She told me she just couldn't face a long event." Becca's voice was steady in the way of someone who had made a decision to be steady and was holding to it. "She lied to me, Nina." "She lies to herself first," I said. "We've always just been downstream of it." Becca sat down then, not at her seat, but in the empty chair beside me that had been set for a guest who'd had a last-minute conflict. She sat down and she looked at the room and she said, quietly, "I'm sorry I wasn't better at seeing it." "You're here," I said. "That counts for something." She nodded. She looked at Daniel. He looked at her with the calm, unhurried attention he brings to everything, and he said, "We're glad you're here, Becca." "We both are." Dinner began at 7:15. The caterers moved through the room with a quiet efficiency that Pilar had drilled into them across 3 rehearsals. The room found its rhythm again, conversation and silverware and the low hum of 300 people sharing a meal. The event did not collapse under the weight of what had happened at the microphone. It absorbed it, the way good rooms absorb difficult things, and then it continued, because life requires continuation regardless of what you have just heard. What I noticed, across that dinner, was the specific quality of the attention the room paid me for the rest of the evening. It was not pity. It was not the uncomfortable overcompensating warmth of people who have witnessed something painful and want to paper over it. It was something more direct than either of those things. It was the particular regard that people extend to someone who has done something they recognize as true. Every guest who stopped at the sweetheart table that evening said some version of the same thing in different words. The words changed. The substance did not. They were saying, "We see you. We have always seen you. And now we understand what you were up against." My father came to the table during the dessert course. He pulled a chair close and sat beside me, and he did not say anything for almost a full minute. He looked at his hands on the tablecloth and then he looked at me and he said, "I should have known." He said it the way someone says something they have been holding for a long time. Not accusation, not apology exactly, something between the two that occupied a territory neither word was sufficient for. "You knew what you knew, Dad," I said. "I should have known more." I took his hand. "You're here. That counts for something too." He stayed at the table for 20 minutes. He talked to Daniel about a building project Daniel's firm had just broken ground on in Savannah. He asked my grandmother Eleanor about her garden. He was, for those 20 minutes, a man simply present at his daughter's wedding, which is what he had always been when he was present at all, and I accepted it for what it was and asked no more of it than that. Sandra's phone went to voicemail the first time Becca called her that night. And the second time. The third time, at 10:43 according to Becca's later account, Sandra picked up. Becca was standing in the hallway outside the Ivy House bathrooms, heels off, barefoot on the polished floor, her maid of honor dress still perfectly pressed because Becca is the kind of person who stays pressed all the way to the end. She told Sandra what had happened. She told her about the microphone and the speaker system and the 300 guests and the 3 minutes and 47 seconds of a voicemail that had been meant for Becca's ears alone. She told her every detail. She did not soften it. Sandra was quiet for a very long time on the other end of the phone. Then she said, "That's not how any of this was supposed to go." "No," Becca said. "But it went exactly the way you made it go." Becca told me all of this the following morning when she called before I was even awake. Daniel answered, handed me the phone, and went to make coffee with the particular consideration of a man who understands when a conversation is not for him. Becca's voice was clear and unhurried, the voice of someone who had done something difficult and was not sorry for it. "She's going to say you ambushed her," Becca said. "She's going to say the voicemail was private and you violated something. She already started with that last night." "Let her," I said. "Nina, she's going to tell people in Millhaven." "Let her tell them," I said. "She called the wrong number. I don't have to explain anything else." Becca was quiet for a moment. "You knew she would come for you after." "Yes. And you did it anyway." "Becca," I said, and I sat up in the hotel room with the morning light coming through the curtains and Daniel's coffee already starting to smell like something good from the kitchen. "I have spent 34 years arranging myself around what my mother would do after. I got married yesterday. I am done arranging." There was a long pause on the line. Then Becca said, "Okay." Just that. One word, 2 syllables, and everything in the way she said it told me that something had shifted between us as well, not only between me and Sandra, but between the sister who had always been chosen first and the sister who had always had to choose herself. "Okay," Becca said again, softer. "I'm with you." By Monday morning, the story had begun to move. By Monday morning, the story had begun to move the way stories move in places where people have known each other long enough to fill in the parts they weren't present for. 300 guests carried it out of the Ivy House ballroom and into their own lives, their own dinners, their own phone calls home. Within a week it had reached Millhaven. Within 2 weeks it had reached every corner of the world Sandra Harmon had spent 4 decades carefully constructing. The charity board called an emergency meeting to discuss her continued involvement. I know this because one of the board members, a woman named Patricia Odom who had attended my wedding as a friend of Daniel's mother, sent me a card. Handwritten, 3 sentences. She said she was sorry for what I had endured. She said the board would be handling the matter privately. She said she hoped Daniel and I were well. That was all. It was enough. Sandra resigned from the Historical Society before they could ask her to step back. She told people she needed to focus on her health. The Christmas open house that December had 11 attendees instead of 40. Nobody announced the change. People simply stopped confirming, the way people quietly stop attending events hosted by someone they are no longer certain they want to be seen with. I did not engineer any of this. I want to be clear about that. I played a voicemail in a room full of people who had a right to know what kind of woman had tried to talk them out of being there. What followed was not a campaign. It was consequence. There is a difference, and the difference matters to me. Sandra called me once. It was a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding. Daniel was working late and I was at my desk reviewing a client proposal when my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring. I let it go to voicemail. I did not listen to the voicemail that night, or the next day. On the 3rd day I opened it and pressed play and listened to my mother's voice say that what I had done was unforgivable, that I had humiliated her in front of people who had known her for decades, that she had done nothing a mother doesn't have the right to feel privately, and that she expected an apology. I saved the voicemail in the same folder. Vendor contacts. Then I set my phone face down on the desk and went back to the proposal. I did not call her back. Not that week, not that month. I am still deciding whether I will. That is the part of this story I want to be honest about, because Clara Weston stories are only worth telling if they are honest all the way to the end. The vindication was real. The consequence was real. The 300 people who stood in that ballroom and heard my mother's voice and understood, finally understood, that was real. But the loss is also real. There is a grief that lives underneath justice that nobody talks about because it is quieter and less satisfying than the justice itself. I do not have the mother I deserved. I never did. And choosing myself, as completely and publicly as I chose myself on October 14th, did not change that. It only clarified it. What I have instead is this. I have a husband who turned the burner back on and asked what I needed. I have a sister who called Sandra in a hotel hallway with her shoes off and told her every detail without softening a single one, and who has called me every Sunday morning since. I have a grandmother Eleanor who danced at my reception until the DJ started packing up and who, when I drove her home that night, held my hand in the back seat the entire way and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. I have a father who stayed at my table for 20 minutes and talked about buildings and gardens and looked like a man who was glad to be present, however late the understanding arrived. I have Pilar, who built a phone pocket into my reception dress 3 months before I told her why I needed it. I have a firm that billed $1.4 million the year after the wedding, because the work did not stop while I was grieving or planning or deciding. The work never stopped. That is the thing about building something of your own. It requires your presence every day, and the daily requirement of it is its own kind of salvation. Harmon Design signed its largest single contract 6 months after the wedding. A boutique hotel group based in Charleston commissioned us to design the interiors of 4 properties across the Southeast. It is the kind of project that changes the shape of a firm, that takes everything you have built quietly over years and suddenly makes it visible to people who weren't watching before. My mother would have called it overreaching. I call it exactly what it is. Evidence. I keep the RSVP card in the top drawer of my desk. Not to punish myself with it. Not as a wound I return to. I keep it because it was the clearest thing my mother ever gave me, and clarity, however painful it arrives, is worth keeping. 2 words in blue ballpoint. Not invited. She was wrong about the event. She was right that I was building something she hadn't been invited into. I had been building it for 34 years. The wedding was just the day I opened the doors and let everyone see. If you are building something that the people who should love you most are refusing to witness, keep building. The witnesses will come. And the room you make for yourself will be larger and more yours than anything they could have given you. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.